The Diocese of Huron-Sequi, to be read on Sunday at least 2 weeks prior to the day of ordination. Notice is hereby given that Luis Enrique Martinez, resident in the parish, intends to offer himself as a candidate for the holy office of priest at the ensuing ordination by the Bishop of Huron. If any person knows any just cause or impediment why he ought not to be admitted to the said office of priest, he or she is hereby requested to declare the same to me or to signify the same herewith to the Bishop of Huron. This certificate we do hereby certify that the above notice was publicly read by the undersigned for the parish of Long Point Bay in St. John's Anglican Church, Port Rowan, Norfolk County, on Sunday, the 13th day of June, 2021. Enrique Martinez is the officiating minister, Veronica Harris and Marie Granger signed as church wardens.
Members of the Long Point Bay community. I want to share with you something this morning. It's going to be grounded in the first reading, and I'll get to that. But one of the things that you'll often hear, and I'm sure you know by now, that I will talk about is when I go out in the bush and discover signs of the presence of God. Happens all the time. And I also know just as well that there are hundreds and hundreds of, probably most, people who go out on those rail trails or go out for a hike in the bush don't see what I see. Why is that? And I'm going to suggest that our expectations, what we expect to discover, will determine to some significant extent what we in fact see. Our expectations will determine what we discover or see, because that's what we're looking for. And that's grounded in that first reading. God sends Samuel to the home of Jesse to select a person to be king. So he goes, and all the kids get lined up, and Samuel doesn't see anybody that strikes him as king material, somebody that would be a good king. And then they send for the only boy that's not there, and that's I'm tripping over myself. The one that's not there is David. I kept thinking of Jesse, and Jesse's the father. Anyway, nobody there seems to be the person that God has chosen. So they send for the one who's not there. He's the youngest, the smallest, and so Samuel's not looking for the youngest and the smallest to be chosen king. But when they bring David in, Samuel recognizes and knows that this is the one who is to be king. So there's a sense in which Samuel's expectations were dictating that he would find the one to be king among Jesse's oldest children, and that's not the case. So what are your expectations about where you go and what you look for? How do you discover God? Where do you discover God? When do you discover God? And I have no doubt whatever, simply, I guess, because of where I have discovered God growing up so often. And I spent a lot of time out in the fields and out in the bush, in the woods, met God. And so I go expecting to see God, expecting to discover signs of God when I go walking in the bush. And do I see God? Do I encounter God? Do I experience God on those walks? Absolutely I do. No question about it. So does my expectation determine where I discover, where I first of all look for God? Sure it does. Does it determine to some extent where I experience God? Sure it does. So when we approach God, or when we try to approach God, we really need to think about what our expectations are. Where do I expect to encounter God? In what ways do I expect to encounter God? If I'm listening for God, where do I expect to hear the voice of God? Those are really important questions, because if we know where we experience God, or where we expect to experience God, that's where it's going to happen. I go out into the bush looking to experience God. Why? Because that's where I've experienced God probably more than any place else in my entire life. All through my life is out in the wilderness, or out in unsettled areas. How about you? Where do you experience the presence of God? And a corollary to that is, where can you experience the presence of God? And my answer would probably be pretty much anywhere. But realistically, it's going to be where you look for the presence of God. If you're looking, you're going to find God's presence. God's presence surrounds us. God's presence covers us. God is always wherever we are. Yes, I know that in my head. Anywhere. But where do I in fact see, meet, talk to, converse with God? In those places that I have met and continue to meet and encounter God. And that's in the outdoors. Not exclusively. there are I've even experienced God in the church. and actually it's funny. I laugh because it's not the first place. I do go when we're allowed. And yes, I do experience God in the church. Oddly enough, it's not the place that I go. I shouldn't say it. I do go expecting to experience God in some form, and it probably will always happen in some form, but not in the visceral kind of way that I experience the presence of God in the outdoors. That's not to say it doesn't happen in a church service. There are times that it does happen. There are times since I've moved here to Brantford that it has occurred when I was in church. That's a while ago because we just have been locked out. So I guess what I'm saying, we need to be at least a little bit like Jesse, go looking for the presence of God, listening for the voice of God, and to be especially sensitive to where you or I normally would encounter God. Where would we normally meet God? In part, it's probably because, for me, that's where I'm open to meet God. That's where I'm looking to experience God. It's where I'm looking to encounter the presence of God, and in that encounter, being open to whatever God has to tell me at that particular time. Sometimes it's unexpected, sometimes it's what I expected, sometimes it reminds me of things that I've completely forgotten. God's got a better memory than I do. Remember when I told you? Oh yeah, right. So our expectations, to some extent, are going to control or determine where and how we experience God. May this be a week of incredible experiences. They will be. Will we be wise enough and open enough to see and to encounter God as God chooses to be with us? Have an incredible week of discovery. God bless.